On a winter evening in 1943, Nikola Tesla died alone in room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel. The man who had illuminated the modern world spent his final years in a faded Manhattan tower that once claimed to be the tallest hotel on Earth. His body lay undiscovered for a day behind a "Do Not Disturb" sign. When staff finally entered, they found him in bed, hands folded, precisely as he had arranged himself. The FBI arrived within hours to seize his papers. The hotel continued operating as if nothing had happened. This is the story of a building that promised permanence and delivered something else entirely. A palace that rose during excess, aged through depression and war, and became a refuge for the desperate and eccentric. Understanding Tesla's death requires understanding the hotel itself. And that hotel did not even exist until 1929. New York City in the 1920s was engaged in a vertical race that no one could win. Every year brought taller buildings. Steel frames climbed higher. Developers competed to claim records that would be obsolete within months. The skyline transformed constantly as construction crews worked through winters to add floors that would briefly hold the title of tallest before the next tower surpassed them. Hotels participated in this competition with particular intensity. The decade saw an explosion of lodging construction as developers recognized that business travelers and tourists needed somewhere to stay in a city that was rapidly becoming the commercial center of the world. The Hotel McAlpin opened in 1912 with 1,500 rooms. The Hotel Pennsylvania followed in 1919 with 2,200 rooms. Each claimed to be the largest in the world. Each was correct until the next one opened. The boom had economic logic behind it. Prohibition had begun in 1920, but Manhattan remained the entertainment capital of America. Broadway theaters drew crowds every night. Jazz clubs operated in basement speakeasies. Wealthy visitors arrived by train at Pennsylvania Station, needing accommodations within walking distance. Business conventions filled hotels for weeks at a time. The demand seemed inexhaustible. Developers borrowed heavily to fund construction. Banks competed to provide financing for projects that promised steady returns from room rates and restaurant revenue. The mathematics looked favorable. A hotel with 2,000 rooms charging $3 per night could generate revenue that would repay construction loans within a decade. After that, everything was profit. Matt Canner saw the opportunity clearly. He was a builder who had made his fortune constructing apartment buildings and commercial properties throughout Manhattan. In 1927, he began assembling parcels of land along 8th Avenue between 34th and 35th Streets. The location offered strategic advantages. Pennsylvania Station sat 2 blocks south. The garment district surrounded the site, bringing thousands of workers and buyers to the neighborhood daily. The land was expensive but available. Canner hired Sugarman and Berger as architects. The firm had experience with large-scale commercial buildings, but wanted to create something unprecedented. They brought in Ralph T. Walker as consulting architect. Walker had designed the New York Telephone Company building in a distinctive Art Deco style that demonstrated his ability to combine modern materials with decorative elements that gave buildings individual character. He would shape the New Yorker's exterior identity. The design called for 43 stories, rising from a base that occupied the entire block. The tower would contain 2,503 rooms, surpassing the Hotel Pennsylvania to become the world's largest hotel. More importantly, it would be the tallest hotel structure on Earth, rising 512 feet from street level to roof. The height mattered. It announced ambition and modernity in a city where both qualities were currency. Walker designed the exterior in brick, with Art Deco ornamentation concentrated at the crown. Terracotta panels depicted stylized eagles and geometric patterns. The vertical emphasis was deliberate, drawing the eye upward toward setbacks that occurred at the upper floors, as required by zoning laws. The building would be visible from blocks away, a beacon for travelers arriving by train or taxi. Construction began in 1928. The site required demolition of existing buildings before excavation could start. Workers cleared debris through the summer. By fall, they were pouring concrete for foundations that would support extraordinary weight. A 43-story tower demanded engineering precision. The steel frame rose rapidly once the foundation was complete, with crews adding floors at a pace that impressed observers who watched from surrounding buildings. The interior plans were even more ambitious than the exterior. Every room would have a private bathroom, still a luxury in 1928 when many hotels offered shared facilities. Each room would be equipped with a radio, an innovation that few competitors could match. Ice water would be available on tap in every room, piped through a centralized refrigeration system that represented the latest in mechanical engineering. Soundproofing between rooms used cork and mineral wool insulation, ensuring that guests would not hear their neighbors through walls. The hotel would contain multiple restaurants, ballrooms for conventions and social events, barber shops, beauty parlors, a hospital floor with operating rooms, and a printing plant in the basement capable of producing menus and promotional materials. It was designed to be self-contained, a vertical city where guests could arrive and never need to leave the building for any service. Canner had secured financing through a complex arrangement of mortgages and bonds. The total construction cost approached $23 million, an extraordinary sum that reflected both the building's scale and the expensive materials and systems being installed. The investors expected returns from room rates, restaurant revenue, and retail leases on the ground floor. The calculations showed profit within a decade. By early 1929, the steel frame was complete. Workers installed windows through the spring and summer. Interior finishing began on lower floors, while upper floors were still being enclosed. The schedule was aggressive. Canner wanted to open before the end of the year to capture the winter travel season, when conventions filled Manhattan hotels. October 1929 arrived. The stock market, which had been climbing throughout the decade, began showing instability. On October 24th, prices dropped sharply. Panic selling accelerated over the following week. By October 29th, the crash was complete. Billions in paper wealth vanished. Banks that had financed real estate projects suddenly faced defaulting loans across their portfolios. The economic boom that had fueled hotel construction evaporated overnight. Canner pushed forward. The New Yorker was too far along to stop. Construction continued through the fall. By December, the building was ready. The opening was scheduled for January 2, 1930. The timing was catastrophic but unavoidable. A hotel under construction generates no revenue. An open hotel at least has a chance. The grand opening drew crowds despite the economic anxiety spreading through the city. Guests arrived for a gala dinner and tours of the building. The ballrooms hosted orchestras. Reporters toured the mechanical systems and marveled at the ice water on tap. The radio in every room impressed visitors who still considered broadcasting a novelty. The building showcased everything modern engineering could deliver. The hotel's official height was listed at 512 feet, making it the tallest hotel structure in the world. The claim was accurate on opening day. It would remain true for several years. But in January 1930, as unemployment began rising and businesses started closing across Manhattan, the achievement felt hollow. The New Yorker opened at precisely the wrong moment in history. The first months tested Canner's assumptions. Room occupancy ran lower than projected. Convention bookings decreased as companies cut travel budgets. Restaurant revenue suffered as fewer guests chose to dine in-house. The Depression had arrived with brutal speed, and the hotel industry was among the first to feel the impact. But the New Yorker survived those early months through reputation and location. It was new, tall, and modern. Guests who could still afford Manhattan hotels chose the New Yorker because it represented the newest and finest available. The building's innovations attracted curiosity. The radio in every room became a marketing point that competitors could not match. The private bathrooms and ice water on tap demonstrated luxury that justified slightly higher rates. By the end of 1930, the New Yorker Hotel stood as evidence of both ambition and terrible timing. The tallest hotel in a city where height no longer mattered as much as survival. The early 1930s tested every assumption Matt Canner had made about hotel economics. Room rates dropped as competition for guests intensified. Hotels across Manhattan offered discounts that cut into profit margins. The New Yorker maintained higher rates than many competitors, justified by its modern amenities, but occupancy remained below projections. Empty rooms generated no revenue, regardless of how impressive the building appeared from the street. The hotel adapted through aggressive marketing. Management emphasized the innovations that set the New Yorker apart. Radio in every room became a selling point in advertisements placed in newspapers and magazines. The ice water on tap attracted mention in travel guides. The private bathrooms, still uncommon in older hotels, gave the New Yorker an advantage with guests who could afford to choose. Convention business provided stability. Trade associations and professional organizations still held annual meetings, despite the Depression. They needed large venues with ballrooms and dining facilities capable of handling hundreds of attendees. The New Yorker's size worked in its favor here. The building could accommodate events that smaller hotels had to turn away. Engineers' conventions, medical associations, and business groups booked space for multi-day gatherings that filled rooms and restaurants simultaneously. The hotel also benefited from its connection to radio broadcasting. NBC established studios on the premises shortly after opening. The arrangement brought performers and technical staff to the building regularly. Live broadcasts originated from the New Yorker, giving the hotel publicity that money could not buy. Listeners across the country heard announcers mention transmitting from the New Yorker Hotel in New York City. The association with modern technology reinforced the building's image as a symbol of progress. The technology inside the building was genuinely advanced. The centralized refrigeration system that supplied ice water to 2,503 rooms represented engineering on a scale few buildings had attempted. The heating and cooling systems used innovations that made the hotel more comfortable than older competitors. The electrical infrastructure could handle the power demands of radios, lights, and mechanical systems throughout a 43-story tower, without the failures that plagued buildings designed before electricity became ubiquitous. But innovation required maintenance. The complex mechanical systems needed constant attention from skilled technicians. The refrigeration plant consumed enormous amounts of electricity. The boilers that heated the building through winter burned coal that arrived by truck and had to be stored in basement bunkers. Operating costs remained high even when revenue declined. Staff reductions helped control expenses, but a building this size demanded minimum staffing levels regardless of occupancy rates. Canner refinanced the property in 1931. The original financing structure had assumed occupancy rates and room prices that no longer reflected reality. Banks holding the mortgages faced their own crises as loan defaults spread across their real estate portfolios. Negotiations were difficult. The eventual terms gave Canner breathing room, but at a cost. Interest rates increased. Control shifted partially to creditors. The New Yorker had become a burden to everyone involved. The hotel still attracted notable guests. Celebrities staying in New York often chose the New Yorker for its combination of modern luxury and central location. Politicians attending events in Manhattan booked rooms there. European visitors arriving by ship at the Hudson River piers found the hotel convenient and impressive. The guest registry included names that appeared regularly in newspapers. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt's inauguration brought renewed optimism. The New Deal promised government intervention to stabilize the economy. Banks reopened. Unemployment programs began. The immediate panic subsided even though recovery remained distant. Hotels like the New Yorker survived this period through resilience and small advantages. The building's reputation helped. Its age worked in its favor. new enough to feel modern, but old enough to have established itself before the worst of the Depression hit. The mid-30s brought gradual improvement. Occupancy rates increased slightly, room prices stabilized. Convention bookings remained steady. The New Yorker was not thriving, but it was no longer in immediate danger of foreclosure. Management maintained standards that kept the hotel competitive. The lobbies were cleaned and polished, the restaurants served quality meals. The mechanical systems continued functioning reliably. Guests received the service they paid for. The hotel had also become home to a different category of resident. Long-term guests began occupying rooms on upper floors. These were not tourists or business travelers passing through for a few nights. They were individuals who needed permanent housing and chose to live in a hotel rather than rent an apartment. Some were elderly. Others were professionals who traveled frequently and preferred the convenience of hotel services to maintaining their own households. A few were simply eccentric, people with enough money to afford hotel life, but not enough to buy property in Manhattan. The New Yorker accommodated these permanent residents with negotiated rates far below the nightly charges advertised to transient guests. A room that cost $4 per night for a tourist might rent for $60 per month to someone signing a long-term agreement. The arrangement benefited both parties. Residents gained stability and access to dining rooms and services. The hotel filled rooms that might otherwise sit empty and collected steady monthly revenue regardless of tourist season fluctuations. This dual function, part transient hotel and part residential building, would define the New Yorker's character for decades. The building was large enough to house both populations without conflict. Permanent residents occupied higher floors, where they would not encounter the constant flow of short-term guests. The hotel maintained separate elevator banks and designated certain dining facilities for residents only. The system worked because the building had been designed with excess capacity that the Depression had made permanent. By 1935, the New Yorker Hotel had survived 5 years of economic catastrophe. It had not prospered. Canner had not realized the profits he projected when construction began in 1928. But the building stood. The rooms were occupied. The restaurants served meals. The mechanical systems functioned. In a decade that destroyed thousands of businesses and left buildings abandoned across Manhattan, survival constituted success. The hotel's reputation had evolved. It was no longer the newest or most fashionable destination. Wealthier travelers might choose the Waldorf Astoria or the Plaza for their associations with established society. But the New Yorker offered something increasingly valuable in the 30s: reliable quality at reasonable prices. The innovations that seemed extravagant in 1930 now had become standard amenities that guests expected. Radio in every room was no longer remarkable. Private bathrooms were becoming universal in new construction. Ice water on tap was a convenience, not a marvel. What the New Yorker possessed was solid construction, central location, and sufficient scale to remain economically viable even when occupancy ran below capacity. The building could operate at 60% occupancy and still cover its costs. Smaller hotels could not. They required near full occupancy to survive. The New Yorker's size, which had seemed excessive during construction, became its advantage. During Depression, empty rooms on the 40th floor did not prevent the hotel from serving guests on the 10th floor. The building was too large to fail completely. The late 1930s brought the New Yorker Hotel a measure of stability it had not known since opening. Occupancy rates climbed above 70%. Convention bookings filled the calendar during peak seasons. The worst of the Depression was passing. Though recovery remained incomplete, the hotel had weathered the crisis through location, scale, and the modest advantage of being slightly newer than its oldest competitors. The guest registry from this period reads like a directory of American achievement and celebrity. Politicians stayed at the New Yorker when attending events in Manhattan. Senators and congressmen preferred it for its combination of discretion and service. The hotel was large enough that a public figure could move through the lobbies without constant recognition, yet close enough to Penn Station that travel to Washington remained convenient. Entertainers chose the New Yorker for similar reasons. Broadway performers stayed there between shows, musicians performing at Radio City Music Hall or Carnegie Hall booked rooms for extended runs. The NBC studios on the premises brought radio personalities to the building regularly. Bob Hope stayed at the New Yorker, so did Benny Goodman. The hotel became a gathering place for performers who wanted proximity to Midtown theaters without the formal stuffiness of older establishments. Athletes discovered the New Yorker during this period. Baseball teams visiting New York to play the Yankees or Giants often housed their players at the hotel. The rooms were comfortable. The dining facilities could handle team meals. The location gave players easy access to the stadiums. Joe DiMaggio stayed at the New Yorker early in his career. So did players from visiting teams who would later be inducted into the Hall of Fame. The hotel staff became accustomed to recognizing famous faces in the elevators and restaurants. The building also served as a showcase for technological innovation in ways that extended beyond the radio studios. In 1936, RCA demonstrated early television technology at the New Yorker. Engineers set up experimental equipment in one of the ballrooms and broadcast test signals to receivers positioned around the room. The demonstration attracted engineers, investors, and journalists who wanted to witness the future of broadcasting. Television was still years away from commercial viability, but the New Yorker had positioned itself as a venue where such experiments happened. The hotel's mechanical systems continued to impress visitors familiar with engineering. The centralized ice water system remained unusual enough that trade publications wrote articles describing how it worked. The refrigeration plant in the basement produced chilled water that circulated through pipes to every floor. Guests simply turned a tap marked ice water and received water cold enough to require no additional ice. The system consumed enormous electricity but delivered consistent results across 2,503 rooms. The air handling systems were equally sophisticated. The New Yorker had been designed with ventilation in mind. Fresh air entered through intakes on the roof, passed through filters and conditioning units, then distributed throughout the building via ductwork concealed in walls and ceilings. Exhaust vents removed stale air and kitchen odors. The system was not true air conditioning by modern standards, but it was far superior to the open windows and electric fans that most buildings relied on during summer. Service standards remained high because management understood that reputation depended on consistency. The dining room served meals that compared favorably to independent restaurants. The kitchens employed experienced cooks who prepared food in quantities that would challenge smaller establishments. A typical evening might see 800 dinners served across multiple dining facilities. The hotel operated a commissary system, where raw ingredients arrived in bulk, were processed, and stored in basement facilities, then delivered to kitchens as needed. The efficiency kept food costs manageable while maintaining quality. The staff required to maintain these service levels numbered in the hundreds. Housekeepers cleaned rooms daily. Bellhops carried luggage and ran errands. Front desk clerks processed check-ins and check-outs continuously. The telephone switchboard employed operators around the clock to connect calls and provide wake-up service. Maintenance workers repaired plumbing, replaced light bulbs, and kept mechanical systems functioning. The building was a small city that required constant attention from an army of employees who rarely received recognition beyond their paychecks. Labor relations in hotels were often difficult. Workers faced long hours and modest wages. The New Yorker employees organized in the mid-30s, joining unions that represented hotel workers across Manhattan. Management negotiated contracts that established minimum pay scales and working conditions. Strikes were threatened, but generally avoided. The hotel needed workers, and workers needed jobs. Both sides recognized the mutual dependence that made extreme confrontation counterproductive. The permanent residents occupying upper floors formed a distinct community within the building. Some had lived at the New Yorker since the early 30s. They had watched the hotel evolve from a struggling enterprise to a stable operation. Many were elderly, choosing hotel life over the difficulties of maintaining apartments. Others were professionals, whose work required frequent travel. A few were simply people who preferred hotel living to conventional domesticity. These residents developed relationships with staff that transcended typical guest interactions. They knew the front desk clerks by name. They had favorite tables in the dining rooms. They received special consideration when requesting services. In return, they provided stable monthly revenue and rarely caused difficulties. Management valued them as anchors who kept the upper floors occupied regardless of tourist season fluctuations. The New Yorker also housed a less visible population. The building's size created opportunities for people to disappear inside it. Rooms on higher floors sometimes accommodated individuals who paid cash and registered under names that might not match the identification they carried. The hotel asked few questions as long as bills were paid. This discretion attracted people with reasons to avoid scrutiny. Some were simply private. Others had more specific needs for anonymity. By 1939, the New Yorker Hotel had fully established its character. It was not the most exclusive hotel in Manhattan. The Waldorf Astoria and the Plaza occupied that territory. It was not the newest. The building was nearly a decade old, ancient by the standards of a city that constantly demolished and rebuilt. But the New Yorker had found its place as a reliable mid-level establishment that offered modern amenities, central location, and reasonable rates. It was the hotel where senators stayed when they did not need to impress constituents. It was where baseball players stayed when they wanted comfort without ceremony. It was where businessmen stayed when expense accounts mattered. The building had survived its disastrous opening timing. It had weathered the Depression. It had adapted to economic realities that defeated many competitors. The innovations that seemed extravagant in '30 had become standard features that guests expected. The New Yorker was no longer remarkable for having radios in every room. It was simply a good hotel that functioned reliably in a city where reliability mattered more than flash. The hotel's financial situation had stabilized without ever achieving the profitability originally projected. Canner and his investors had refinanced multiple times. Control had passed, partially to creditors, but the building was generating sufficient revenue to cover its operating costs and debt service. Empty rooms on the 40th floor no longer represented catastrophic failure. They were simply capacity that could be filled when demand returned. Everything was about to change again. War came to the New Yorker Hotel on December 7, 1941. That Sunday afternoon, guests gathered in the lobbies and dining rooms, listening to radios as news arrived from Pearl Harbor. By evening, the reality was clear. The United States would enter World War II. Everything would change, including the patterns of hotel life that had stabilized during the late 30s. The immediate impact was occupancy. Military officers began arriving in Manhattan within days. The War Department needed accommodations for personnel assigned to headquarters operations, logistics planning, and procurement offices scattered throughout the city. The New Yorker had the capacity and location to house them. Rooms that had sometimes sat empty during the Depression filled with Army and Navy officers who needed places to sleep while coordinating the massive mobilization effort. Servicemen on leave flooded into New York throughout the war. The city was a departure point for troops shipping to Europe and a destination for those returning. Soldiers and sailors with a few days of freedom wanted to experience Manhattan before heading overseas. They needed affordable lodging within reach of entertainment districts. The New Yorker accommodated them alongside the permanent residents and business travelers who had always occupied the building. The hotel adapted its operations to wartime conditions. Food rationing affected restaurant menus. Certain ingredients became scarce. The kitchen substituted available items and adjusted recipes to work around shortages. Guests understood. Everyone was making sacrifices. The dining rooms remained popular because they delivered consistent quality within rationing constraints. A meal at the New Yorker might not match pre-war standards, but it was reliable and professionally prepared. Staff shortages presented greater challenges. Young men who had worked as bellhops, maintenance workers, and kitchen staff enlisted or were drafted. Women filled many positions previously held exclusively by men. The front desk began employing female clerks. Housekeeping departments expanded. The telephone switchboard had always employed women as operators, but now they took on additional responsibilities as male supervisors left for military service. The building itself took on new functions. The hospital floor, originally designed to serve hotel guests needing medical attention, expanded its capacity. Military doctors used the facilities to examine recruits and treat servicemen with minor ailments. The operating rooms saw more use during the war years than during any comparable period in the hotel's history. The arrangement benefited both parties. The military gained convenient medical facilities in Midtown Manhattan. The hotel received payment for space that had often been underutilized. Security increased throughout the building. The New Yorker housed military personnel and visiting officials dealing with classified information. Guards began monitoring entrances more carefully. Room keys were tracked with greater precision. Management became more cautious about who was allowed to wander the corridors. The building's size had always made complete security impossible, but wartime brought new attention to access control. The NBC studios on the premises broadcast war news and propaganda programming. Radio had become essential for maintaining public morale and disseminating government messages. Performers who had entertained pre-war audiences now participated in broadcasts supporting war bonds and encouraging enlistment. The studios operated continuously, producing content that reached millions of listeners who associated the New Yorker Hotel with the voices coming through their speakers. Financial conditions improved dramatically. Occupancy rates approached 90%. The hotel could charge higher rates because demand exceeded supply. Conventions returned as industries ramped up production to meet military contracts. Engineers, manufacturers, and government contractors needed meeting spaces in New York. The New Yorker's ballrooms hosted gatherings that would have been impossible during the Depression. Revenue reached levels that finally justified the original construction investment. The war also brought tragedy to the building in ways that had nothing to do with military action. On July 28, 1945, a B-25 bomber lost in fog crashed into the Empire State Building 14 blocks south. The accident killed 14 people and shocked the city. The New Yorker staff watched smoke rise from the impact site. The incident reminded everyone that even in Manhattan, far from combat zones, war brought danger. The fog that morning had been dense enough that pilots could barely see buildings until collision was inevitable. The Empire State Building crash occurred just weeks before Japan surrendered. By August 1945, the war was over. The New Yorker Hotel had survived another crisis, this time emerging in stronger condition than when it began. The building had housed military officers, sheltered servicemen on leave, and adapted to wartime shortages. It had maintained operations while competitors struggled. Most importantly, it had finally achieved the occupancy rates and revenue that had been projected 15 years earlier when construction began. The immediate post-war period brought changes that seemed positive at first. Veterans returned seeking civilian employment. The hotel rehired former staff and expanded departments to handle continued high occupancy. Business conventions resumed at pre-war levels. The economy was growing rapidly as industries converted from military to civilian production. Demand for hotel rooms remained strong through 46 and into 47. But competition was returning as well. The war had delayed construction of new hotels. Now developers were planning projects that would add rooms to Manhattan's inventory. The New Yorker was aging. The building that had seemed modern in 30 was approaching 20 years old. Mechanical systems needed updating. Decor was dated. Competitors would soon offer newer facilities with more current styling. The permanent residents who had occupied upper floors throughout the Depression and war years were aging as well. Some had lived at the New Yorker for 15 years. They were elderly now, requiring additional services and attention. The hotel continued accommodating them because they provided stable revenue, but the population was shifting toward retirees rather than the mix of professionals and eccentrics who had originally chosen hotel living. The hotel's reputation was also evolving in ways management could not control. The New Yorker was becoming known as a place that tolerated unusual residents. It housed people who paid cash and asked for privacy. It asked few questions about why someone chose to live in a hotel room rather than rent an apartment. This discretion attracted individuals who valued anonymity. Some were harmless eccentrics. Others had more complicated reasons for avoiding conventional housing. By 1948, the New Yorker Hotel had operated for 18 years. It had survived the Depression, weathered World War II, and emerged as a profitable operation. The building stood as a testament to durability in an industry where failure was common. It had outlasted competitors who opened with similar ambitions. It had adapted to economic conditions that destroyed other enterprises. The mechanical system still functioned. The rooms were still occupied. The restaurants still served meals. But the hotel was no longer new. The innovations that had distinguished it in 30 were standard features in 48. Radio in every room was expected rather than impressive. Private bathrooms were universal in modern construction. Ice water on tap was convenient but not remarkable. The building's competitive advantage had eroded as the industry caught up to standards the New Yorker had pioneered. The financial structure remained complex. Multiple refinancings had distributed ownership among creditors and investors. Management answered to various parties with different priorities. Some wanted to maximize short-term revenue. Others advocated for reinvestment in maintenance and upgrades. The competing interests made consistent long-term planning difficult. Decisions were made by committee, with results that satisfied no one completely. The hotel's future depended on its ability to remain competitive as new construction added modern facilities to Manhattan's hotel inventory. The New Yorker had advantages: central location, proven reliability, and scale that allowed it to serve multiple market segments simultaneously. But advantages were not guarantees. The building needed investment to remain current. Deferred maintenance was beginning to show. Paint was fading. Carpets were wearing. Mechanical systems required upgrades to match newer standards. The stage was set for the next chapter, one that would bring the New Yorker Hotel its most famous resident and cement its place in history for reasons that had nothing to do with its height or innovations. Nikola Tesla arrived at the New Yorker Hotel in 1933. He was 77 years old, broke, and alone. The inventor who had transformed electrical engineering through his work on alternating current had spent the final decades of his life proposing increasingly grandiose projects that never materialized. Wireless power transmission, earthquake machines, death rays. Investors had long since stopped returning his calls. His bank accounts were empty. He survived on a small pension from his former employer, Westinghouse Electric, and the charity of a few remaining admirers. He had been living at the Hotel Governor Clinton on West 31st Street, but unpaid bills forced him to leave. The management at the New Yorker agreed to take him in despite his inability to pay market rates. The hotel's owners understood his situation. Tesla had been famous once. He still commanded a certain respect among engineers and scientists who recognized his contributions to modern electrical systems. The arrangement was not entirely charitable. The hotel benefited from the prestige of housing a legendary inventor, even one whose best work was decades behind him. Room 3327 became Tesla's final residence. The room sat on the 33rd floor. high enough to offer views across Midtown Manhattan, but small enough to be practical for long-term occupancy. It contained a bed, a desk, a chair, and a small bathroom. Tesla required nothing more. He had lived in hotels for most of his adult life, preferring their simplicity to the complications of maintaining a conventional household. He had never married. He had no family in America. His possessions fit in a few trunks. The room cost $2.50 per day. Tesla could not pay that amount reliably. Western Union Company, his former employer, covered much of his bill as a form of retirement support. The hotel accepted delayed payments and sometimes wrote off accumulated debt. Management had decided that housing Tesla cost less than the negative publicity of evicting him would generate. He was elderly and harmless. He caused no problems beyond his inability to pay. Tesla established routines that rarely varied. He woke early, dressed in clothes that were clean but increasingly worn, and left the hotel on foot. He walked to the New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue, several blocks away. There he spent hours reading newspapers and technical journals, filling notebooks with calculations and ideas that would never be realized. The library staff recognized him. They allowed him to occupy his usual seat without interference. His most notable routine involved pigeons. Tesla fed them daily in Bryant Park, the green space behind the library. He purchased bird seed with money that might have been better spent on meals. He stood among the birds, allowing them to land on his outstretched arms. He spoke to them softly in his native Serbian. Observers who watched this elderly man covered in pigeons had no idea they were witnessing one of the most important electrical engineers in history. He returned to the New Yorker each evening, walking the same route he had taken in the morning. He ate sparingly in his room, or occasionally in one of the hotel's dining facilities when his finances permitted. He retired early. The pattern repeated daily with minimal variation. His life had contracted to a narrow circuit between the hotel, the library, and the park. The hotel staff learned to accommodate his eccentricities. Maids who cleaned his room discovered stacks of notebooks filled with mathematical calculations and diagrams. They left everything undisturbed, understanding that Tesla valued his papers above all other possessions. He was polite but distant in his interactions with employees. He rarely engaged in conversation beyond basic courtesy. He seemed to exist in his own world, visiting the present only when necessity required it. On the morning of January 8, 1943, a maid knocked on the door of room 3327. No response came. The Do Not Disturb sign had been hanging there for 3 days. Hotel policy normally required respecting such signs, but staff had grown concerned. Tesla was elderly and frail. 3 days without contact was unusual even for him. The maid used her master key and opened the door. Tesla lay on the bed, fully clothed, hands folded across his chest. He had arranged himself carefully before death. His body was positioned precisely, as if he had composed a final tableau. The room was orderly. Papers covered the desk in neat stacks. The notebooks that contained his life's final work sat where he had left them. Nothing appeared disturbed. The maid retreated and notified management immediately. The hotel doctor arrived within minutes and confirmed what was obvious. Tesla had been dead for at least a day, possibly longer. The cause appeared to be coronary thrombosis. His heart had simply stopped. He was 86 years old. The New Yorker hotel contacted the coroner's office. Officials arrived to examine the body and room. They found no signs of foul play. Tesla had died alone of natural causes. The medical examiner estimated that death had occurred on January 7th, sometime in the evening or early morning hours. The Do Not Disturb sign had been Tesla's final communication with the world. The hotel staff sealed the room and waited for instructions about what to do with Tesla's belongings. The trunks and papers would need to be inventoried. Someone would have to claim the body. The unpaid hotel bill would need to be settled. But first, the authorities had questions. The FBI arrived before noon. 2 agents appeared at the hotel asking to examine Tesla's room and papers. They had been monitoring him for years. His claims about death ray weapons and Teleforce devices had kept him on a watch list throughout the war. Now that he was dead, the government wanted to know if any of his supposed inventions actually existed. The agents spent hours searching room 3327. They examined every notebook, every loose paper, every diagram. They photographed documents and made lists of everything they found. Tesla's nephew, Sava Kosanovich, arrived during the search and protested. He argued that the papers belonged to the estate and that the FBI had no right to seize them. The agents ignored him. Wartime security concerns overrode normal property rights. The FBI eventually removed several trunks of materials from the room. They claimed the papers contained information relevant to national defense. Kosanovich filed protests with the State Department, arguing that his uncle's work was personal property, not government secrets. The dispute would continue for years. In the immediate aftermath of Tesla's death, the FBI controlled access to everything he had written during his final years. The Office of Alien Property also became involved. Tesla had been a naturalized American citizen since 1891, but his Serbian birth complicated matters. The agency, which managed property belonging to foreign nationals during wartime, claimed jurisdiction over the estate. They took possession of additional materials from the hotel room, adding to the confusion about who owned what. The New Yorker hotel management wanted the room cleared and returned to inventory. A dead guest was unfortunate but manageable. A dead guest whose belongings sparked government investigations was a publicity problem. The hotel cooperated fully with authorities, providing access to the room and answering questions about Tesla's final days. Management emphasized that he had been elderly, sick, and died peacefully of natural causes. There was no scandal here, just an old man reaching the end of his life. The funeral took place on January 12, 1943, at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine on the Upper West Side. The service drew a modest crowd. Engineers and scientists who remembered Tesla's contributions attended. A few officials from companies that had employed him decades earlier came to pay respects. The general public barely noticed. Newspapers ran brief obituaries noting his death, but war news dominated the front pages. Tesla's passing was treated as a minor story about an inventor whose glory days were long past. The body was cremated. The ashes were placed in a golden sphere and initially stored at a cemetery in Queens. Years later, they would be transferred to the Tesla Museum in Belgrade. For now, they sat in an urn while lawyers argued over papers and property rights. Back at the New Yorker Hotel, room 3327 was cleaned and prepared for new occupants. The staff removed all traces of Tesla's decade-long residence. The notebooks were gone, seized by government agencies. The few personal items he had owned were packed into boxes and turned over to Kosanovich. The room was painted. Fresh linens were placed on the bed. New towels hung in the bathroom. Within days, another guest checked into 3327, unaware of who had died there. The hotel resumed normal operations. Tesla's death created no lasting disruption. Rooms turned over constantly. Guests came and went. One elderly inventor dying peacefully in his sleep was not remarkable in a building that had housed thousands over 13 years. The staff who had known Tesla remembered him as polite and eccentric, but hardly extraordinary. They had seen many unusual residents. He was simply one more. But rumors began circulating almost immediately. The FBI's involvement sparked speculation. Why would federal agents search a dead inventor's hotel room unless he had actually discovered something valuable? The death ray stories resurfaced. People who had dismissed Tesla as a crank began wondering if perhaps he had been working on genuine weapons technology. The government's secrecy about the seized papers only intensified curiosity. Conspiracy theories developed. throughout 1943 and beyond. Some claim Tesla had been murdered to prevent foreign agents from obtaining his inventions. Others insisted that the US government had stolen his death ray designs and was secretly developing the weapon. A few argued that Tesla had transmitted his most important discoveries telepathically before death, ensuring that the knowledge would survive even if his papers were destroyed. None of these theories had evidence supporting them. All persisted anyway. The truth was considerably less dramatic. The FBI examined Tesla's papers thoroughly and found nothing of military value. The notebooks contained speculation, theoretical calculations, and ideas that existed only on paper. No working prototypes existed. No detailed blueprints for functional weapons were discovered. Tesla had spent his final years imagining devices he no longer had the resources or capability to build. The government quietly returned most of the seized materials to his estate in 1952. The papers had never contained secrets worth protecting. The New Yorker Hotel gained a place in history through Tesla's death that it had never achieved through its height or innovations. The building would be remembered as the place where one of history's most important electrical engineers died alone in a small room on the 33rd floor. The irony was sharp. Tesla had revolutionized power transmission and helped create the electrical grid that powered millions of homes and businesses. He ended his life unable to pay his own electric bill, dependent on the charity of a hotel that tolerated him because eviction would be embarrassing. Room 3327 continued housing guests who knew nothing of its previous occupant. The hotel did not advertise Tesla's connection to the building. Management saw no marketing advantage in reminding guests that a famous inventor had died there. The story spread anyway through word of mouth and occasional newspaper articles. Over decades, the room would acquire a reputation among Tesla admirers who made pilgrimages to the New Yorker, hoping to visit the site of his death. The hotel itself was aging alongside its most famous former resident. By the mid-40s, the New Yorker was 15 years old. The wartime boom was ending. Competition from newer hotels was intensifying. The building that had seemed modern in '30 now looked dated compared to post-war construction. Mechanical systems needed upgrades. Decor required updating. The innovations that had distinguished the New Yorker at opening were now standard features that every hotel offered. Tesla's death marked the end of one era for the building. The hotel had housed a legend during his final years. It had provided shelter when no one else would. The connection would last longer than anything else associated with the building's history. Decades after the New Yorker stopped operating as a conventional hotel, people would still remember it as the place where Nikola Tesla died. The New Yorker Hotel entered a long decline after Tesla's death. The immediate post-war years had seemed promising, but the momentum did not last. By 1950, the building's age was showing. The mechanical systems that had impressed visitors in '30 were failing with increasing frequency. The centralized ice water system required constant maintenance. Pipes corroded. Pumps wore out. The refrigeration plant consumed enormous amounts of electricity to deliver a service that guests now took for granted. Competition intensified throughout the 1950s. New hotels opened across Manhattan with modern amenities and contemporary styling. The Americana opened in '62 with 2,000 rooms and design that reflected current tastes. The New York Hilton followed in '63 with over 2,100 rooms and convention facilities that surpassed anything the New Yorker could offer. These buildings had central air conditioning, not just ventilation systems. They had parking garages. They had restaurants designed by celebrity chefs. They represented what travelers expected in the '60s. The New Yorker could not compete on modernity. The building was over 30 years old. Updating it to match newer hotels would require investment that ownership was unwilling or unable to provide. The financial structure remained complicated. Multiple refinancings had distributed control among creditors with different priorities. Some wanted to extract maximum revenue with minimum investment. Others advocated selling the property to developers who might demolish it for new construction. No consensus emerged about the building's future. Occupancy rates dropped steadily through the 50s. The convention business that had sustained the hotel during the Depression and war years migrated to newer facilities. Business travelers chose hotels with better locations or more modern appointments. The permanent residents who had occupied upper floors for decades were dying off. Younger professionals had no interest in hotel living when affordable apartments were available throughout the city. The neighborhood was changing as well. 8th Avenue had never been Manhattan's most prestigious address. By the 60s, the area was deteriorating. The garment district remained active during business hours, but the streets were empty after dark. Crime increased. Prostitution became visible on corners near the hotel. Tourists walking from Penn Station to Midtown theaters passed through blocks that felt unsafe after sunset. The New Yorker adapted by lowering standards and rates. The hotel began accepting guests who could not afford better accommodations elsewhere. Rooms that had once housed senators and celebrities now sheltered transients paying by the week. Management asked fewer questions about identification and payment methods. The building's size allowed it to serve multiple markets simultaneously. Business conventions still used the ballrooms occasionally. The ground floor restaurants remained operational, but the upper floors increasingly housed a population that other hotels would have rejected. Staff reductions continued throughout the 60s. The New Yorker had employed hundreds during the war years. By 65, the workforce had contracted to a skeleton crew barely adequate to maintain basic operations. Housekeeping standards dropped, rooms were cleaned less frequently, repairs were deferred unless equipment failed completely. The building began showing visible neglect. Paint peeled in hallways, carpets wore through, light fixtures went unreplaced. The hotel that had once showcased American ambition now demonstrated what happened when maintenance was neglected for decades. Financial crisis came in 1967. The hotel filed for bankruptcy protection. Creditors forced a sale. The property changed hands for $12.5 million, a fraction of its original construction cost even accounting for inflation. The new owners promised renovations and renewed investment. Neither materialized. The bankruptcy sale simply transferred the building to different creditors with the same incentives to minimize costs and extract whatever revenue remained. The 1970s brought deterioration that seemed terminal. Entire floors sat empty. The mechanical systems failed more frequently than they functioned. The ice water on tap that had once been a marvel now delivered rusty brown liquid when it delivered anything at all. The heating system worked erratically during winter. Guests complained constantly about cold rooms and broken fixtures. Management responded with apologies and discounted rates, but made no substantial improvements. Crime incidents increased inside the building. The New Yorker had always housed some guests seeking anonymity, but now it attracted people running from law enforcement or creditors. Drug dealing occurred in stairwells. Prostitution operated from rooms rented by the hour. Hotel security was minimal. What staff remained were older employees who had worked at the building for decades and lacked the energy or authority to enforce rules that management no longer cared about maintaining. Several murders occurred in the building during the early 70s. A guest was found dead in his room in 72, killed during a robbery. Another death in 74 appeared to be a suicide, but police suspected foul play. The incidents attracted media attention that further damaged the hotel's reputation. Journalists described the New Yorker as a once grand hotel that had become a refuge for criminals and desperate people with nowhere else to go. Preservationists debated whether the building deserved protection. The New Yorker had architectural significance as one of the tallest hotels from the pre-Depression era. Ralph Walker's Art Deco exterior retained its visual power even as the interior crumbled. But preservation required investment. The building needed millions in renovations to meet modern codes and serve contemporary needs. No one wanted to commit that capital to a property in a declining neighborhood with a damaged reputation. Demolition was discussed seriously for the first time in 1975. The owners explored whether the property was worth more as vacant land than as a failing hotel. Developers looked at the site and saw potential for residential towers or office buildings. The hotel's connection to Tesla was mentioned occasionally, but did not seem sufficient to justify preservation. Most New Yorkers had forgotten that he died there. The few who remembered did not see it as reason enough to save a building that had become an embarrassment. The New Yorker sat mostly empty through 75 and into early 76. Fewer than 200 of the 2,503 rooms were occupied regularly. The restaurants had closed. The ballrooms sat unused. The ground floor retail spaces that had once attracted luxury tenants now housed discount shops or remained vacant. The building was generating barely enough revenue to cover utilities and minimal staffing. Bankruptcy seemed inevitable. Demolition looked likely. Then in May of 1976, something unexpected happened. The Unification Church made an offer to purchase the property. The organization, led by Reverend Sun Myung Moon, was expanding its presence in the United States and needed facilities to house members and host events. The New Yorker offered everything they required: enormous capacity, central location, and a price that reflected desperation rather than market value. The sale closed in July 1976 for $5.6 million. The price was barely half what the previous bankrupt owners had paid 9 years earlier. The Unification Church acquired a 43-story building with over 2,000 rooms in Midtown Manhattan for less than the cost of constructing a small apartment building. The deal seemed impossible except that no one else wanted the property. The Unification Church began renovations immediately after taking possession. The building required massive work. Electrical systems needed updating to meet current codes. Plumbing throughout the structure was failing. The heating system barely functioned. Years of deferred maintenance had created problems that would take years and millions to address. The church committed resources that previous owners had never provided. The renovation was partial rather than complete. The church had specific needs that did not require restoring every room to hotel standards. Upper floors were converted to dormitory-style housing for church members. Rooms were stripped to basics: beds, minimal furniture, shared bathrooms on each floor. The conversion allowed the church to house hundreds of members in a building that would have been impossibly expensive to maintain as a full-service hotel. Lower floors retained hotel function. The church operated the New Yorker as a working hotel to generate revenue and serve visitors attending church events. Guest rooms on floors 2 through 15 were renovated to acceptable standards. New carpets were installed. Bathrooms were updated. The mechanical systems serving these floors received priority attention. The result was a hybrid building, partly hotel, partly dormitory, partly event space. The ballrooms and meeting rooms were fully restored. The church held conferences and gatherings that required large venues. The grand ballroom could accommodate thousands for events. Smaller meeting rooms served workshops and training sessions. The church invested heavily in these spaces because they were essential to the organization's mission. The public areas where events occurred received attention that the dormitory floors did not. The exterior was cleaned and repaired. Decades of city grime had darkened Ralph Walker's Art Deco facade. Workers spent months washing the brick and terracotta, revealing colors that had been invisible under layers of accumulated pollution. Damaged ornamentation was repaired or replaced. The building began looking like something that deserved preservation rather than demolition. The transformation took several years. By 1980, the New Yorker Hotel was functioning again as a hybrid facility that served multiple purposes simultaneously. Church members lived on upper floors. Paying hotel guests occupied lower floors. Conferences and events filled the public spaces. The building that had seemed doomed to demolition was operating at near capacity under a model that no one had anticipated when it was designed 50 years earlier. The Tesla connection experienced a revival during this period. engineers and science enthusiasts began making pilgrimages to room 3327. The church recognized the potential value of this association and began acknowledging it in promotional materials. Room 3327 was not converted to a museum or shrine, but the church allowed interested visitors to see it by arrangement. The room remained a standard guest room, unremarkable, except for its history. Conspiracy theories about Tesla's death and the FBI seizure of his papers continued circulating. The church's ownership of the building added new dimensions to these theories. Some claimed the Unification Church had purchased the New Yorker specifically to control access to secrets Tesla had hidden in room 3327. Others insisted that the church was conducting experiments based on Tesla's theoretical work. None of these claims had any basis in reality, but they persisted in books and articles written by people convinced that Tesla's death concealed important mysteries. The hotel achieved landmark status in 1982. The New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission designated the New Yorker as a protected structure based on its architectural significance and historical importance. The designation meant that the exterior could not be demolished or substantially altered without commission approval. The interior was not protected, allowing the church to continue modifying spaces to meet its operational needs. The neighborhood around the hotel began improving during the 80s. Times Square renovation efforts extended south toward the Garment District. Crime decreased, property values rose. The New Yorker's location, once a liability, became an asset again as Midtown Manhattan redevelopment accelerated. The church found itself owning a building in an increasingly desirable area. The hotel continued operating through economic cycles that would have destroyed it under previous ownership. The church's financial structure was different from commercial hotel operators. The organization did not require maximum profit from the property. Breaking even was sufficient as long as the building served the church's broader mission. This lower financial pressure allowed the New Yorker to survive periods when occupancy dropped and conventional hotels struggled. The dual function as hotel and dormitory created an unusual atmosphere. Hotel guests staying on lower floors encountered church members in lobbies and elevators. The mixing was generally peaceful, but occasionally awkward. Guests checking in for business travel found themselves sharing elevators with young people in matching church attire heading to upper-floor dormitories. The church maintained separation where possible, but the building was too interconnected for complete segregation. Reviews of the hotel during this period were mixed. Guests appreciated low rates and central location. They complained about dated decor and inconsistent service. The rooms were clean but basic. The amenities were minimal compared to modern hotels. Travelers who prioritized affordability over luxury found the New Yorker acceptable. Those expecting comfort comparable to newer establishments were disappointed. The hotel served a budget market segment that kept occupancy steady without demanding constant upgrades. The building's mechanical systems remained problematic despite renovation efforts. The centralized ice water system was finally abandoned in the 90s. The refrigeration plant that had once been a technological marvel was too expensive to maintain for a feature that no longer impressed guests. The pipes were capped. The taps in rooms were removed. The building lost its most distinctive innovation to simple economics. Tesla's reputation grew throughout the 90s and 2000s. New biographies portrayed him as a misunderstood genius whose contributions had been overshadowed by Edison and other contemporaries. Popular culture rediscovered him as a tragic figure who died in poverty, despite revolutionizing electrical engineering. The New Yorker Hotel benefited from this renewed interest. More visitors requested to see room 3327. The church began offering informal tours that included the room where Tesla spent his final years. The hotel also attracted guests who specifically wanted to stay in the building because of its history. These were not typical tourists. They were Tesla enthusiasts, architecture fans, and people interested in the building's unusual ownership. The church recognized this niche market and began emphasizing historical elements in its marketing. Promotional materials mention Tesla, the Art Deco design, and the building's status as a landmark. September 11, 2001, brought new challenges. The terrorist attacks devastated Manhattan's tourism industry. Hotels across the city saw occupancy rates collapse. The New Yorker survived because its hybrid function provided stability. Church members continued occupying dormitory floors regardless of tourist trends. The hotel side struggled but did not fail because it represented only part of the building's purpose. Recovery took years. Tourism gradually returned to Manhattan. The New Yorker's occupancy rates improved. By the mid-2000s, the hotel was operating profitably again within the church's definition of profit. The building was covering its costs, serving church functions, and generating modest surplus revenue. That outcome satisfied ownership in ways that would never satisfy conventional hotel operators demanding maximum returns. The Great Recession of 2008 tested the model again. Hotel bookings declined across Manhattan. The New Yorker weathered the downturn through the same mechanisms that had protected it after September 11th. The church's ownership structure and willingness to accept lower financial returns allowed survival when commercial operators would have faced bankruptcy. The building that had filed for bankruptcy protection in '67 was now more financially stable than many newer competitors. The hotel's reputation in the 2010s was as a budget option in an expensive city. Rooms cost significantly less than comparable locations in Midtown. The trade-off was dated decor and limited amenities. Guests who understood what they were purchasing found value. Those expecting modern hotel standards were disappointed. Online reviews reflected this division. Budget travelers praised the rates and location. Luxury seekers complained about everything. Room 3327 remained a point of fascination. The church allowed some guests to request the room specifically. Others stayed there without realizing its history until checkout, when staff mentioned the Tesla connection. The room itself contained nothing remarkable. It was a standard hotel room with a bed, desk, television, and bathroom. The significance existed entirely in what had happened there 7 decades earlier. The New Yorker Hotel in the 2020s operates much as it did in the 80s after the church's renovation. It functions as a hybrid facility, serving multiple purposes that allow it to survive economic conditions that would destroy a conventional hotel. The building that opened in 1930 as the world's tallest hotel endures not through grandeur but through adaptability. It survived the Depression by accepting long-term residents. It survived World War II by housing military personnel. It survived the 60s and 70s by lowering standards and rates. It survived after '76 by becoming something other than a pure hotel. The irony is complete. The New Yorker was built to showcase American ambition during the boom years before the Depression. It opened at precisely the wrong moment and never achieved the success its builders projected. It became famous primarily because an elderly inventor died there alone and broke. It avoided demolition by being purchased by a religious organization that valued it for reasons unrelated to hotel operations. The building survives not because it succeeded, but because it found ways to endure failure. Tesla would have understood. He spent his final years in room 3327 doing the same thing.